Racially Speaking. I'm David Phipps, your host. And man, it's been way too long. I was just looking back at previous episodes. And Mark, I had you on, I think, episode 6. And I'm up in the 70s now. So, yo, my bad on not having you on more often or more, more frequently. Sorry it's been so long. But yeah, look, if you're watching the video, you see that I'm joined by an old time, like kind of OG guest from when I first started the podcast. That's, like I said, episode 6 it was. But since then, I think it's since then, I'm now joined by
Yeah.
Dr. Mark Samudre. You were doctor back then, I think, but different university. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
got I got my guy,
I was in South
uh,
Carolina at the time when we first.
Dr. Mark
Yeah.
Samudre, a former college roommate, really good friend of over a decade now. Went to college at Radford together, fellow English major. And look, man, it's not that was the last time we talked, but it's been too long since we did this. But then, man, I miss you. Your state's away. We've certainly kept in touch, but
Mhm.
I'm glad to have you back on here. How you been?
Oh, dude. Everything's going good. We transitioned now to University of Kentucky. Been here the past 2 years, and loving it here. We're close to
Sir.
family. We just had another kid since the last time we've done this. So it's wild. The first time we did Racially Speaking podcast,
Yes.
my first kid was born. Very shortly before, and now we're doing it, and now we're on our second one is about 9 months old. So it's kind of, and we have a 5 year old. So, and you
Yeah,
had,
we got
I think, added additions to the Phipps family as well since then. So it's like a lot of life has happened from the time we first did Racially Speaking to now. But at the same time,
uh
in
you're
some
not
ways,
wrong.
we're kind of
You're
right
not
back to
wrong.
where we started when you
Of
first
course, I
started the
love to
podcast,
chop it up with
right?
good friends on here. At the same time,
Yeah.
I often have you and people come on here to talk about maybe not some fun things, but important things. And Mark, you and I um, go back and forth. We stay in contact regularly about issues going on in the world as far as our faith, our kind of political
Mhm.
beliefs, and just kind of passion for caring about topics that surround faith, race, ethnicity, justice, and just wanting to have honest conversations about these things, not just on a podcast, but in our daily lives. And I know it's something that has always kind of, I think, bonded our friendship, at least at a certain level. And so I appreciate you coming back on as a friend and these conversations that we have regularly. But like I said, man, Dr. Samudre, like you're a proper expert that I'm bringing on here. I'm just gonna say that, which I value a lot. Okay, maybe you're not gonna consider yourself an expert in every single thing we're gonna talk about, but look, the pushback to there being too many podcasts out there, everyone have social media now, everyone thinking they're an expert. No one can push back on this because you're about as expert as you can be with the PhD up in there. Um, yeah,
Listen, man, thank you for that, but I'm just going to tell the listeners right now, expect nothing and you'll never be disappointed. So here I am. This is me. Don't listen
they'll
to David and
they'll be
everything
the
he's
judge of that.
saying,
They'll be the
but
judge of that. Well, a little bit. Speaking of like credentials, can you tell our listeners a
yeah.
little bit about your work, what your focus is, and I mean honestly, areas of expertise are? Even though I know you don't like to call yourself an expert,
Man, well, hey, man, listen,
Dr. Dre. Yeah,
you call me Mark. You can call me Dr. Dre
I
for
think you
short.
said
Get
that
it?
literally
Okay.
last episode,
So the
and that was
humor
a long
hasn't
time ago. So
changed.
that's my memory's still working.
It's
Yep.
And folks, we like to recycle humor when possible. I'm assistant professor of special education at the University of Kentucky. My specific focus, I get to work with a lot of teachers. Simply put, get to work with a lot of teachers to support them so they can support their students who engage in challenging behavior. Right now, our work is focused really exclusively on trying to equip
Hmm.
schools to implement alternatives to suspension. So a lot of that is grounded in just providing access to strategies and resources,
Okay.
but also creating sufficient like teacher support systems that exclusionary discipline practices are not overused. So a lot of that work stems from, I think there's a lot of data and evidence to suggest that marginalized and minoritized youth are largely the recipients of exclusionary disciplinary practices. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to aim for less exclusionary
Gotcha.
discipline practices altogether. So we're trying to provide alternatives to that. To keep kids in school, but also to help teachers feel supported, so that way when these situations happen,
Yeah,
it's not a I don't know what to do. It's that all right, let me do this. So that's really where kind of like my work has evolved, and where I'm sitting at right now. I really enjoy it. Get to work with some great folks
that's
that
the secret,
are
man.
way
Surround
smarter than
yourself with
me and that
smarter
I can
people.
learn
That's that.
from.
You got the idea.
So yeah, that's me.
That's really all I do on here. That's great. I mean, what are some of
Oh yeah,
alternatives for people listening to suspension that you guys have kind of come across?
right. So a lot of my work kind
Okay.
of comes from a prevention science approach. Simply put, like, I mean, there's a range of strategies we can implement, but our idea is to create systems in place that prevent some of these challenging instances of behavior infractions occurring from the get. So, in that vein, though, what our research and what our work and teaching is closely tied to is training teachers to implement different things. So these can be higher rates of strategies like behavior specific praise, opportunities to respond, increasing teacher rapport with students. It could be implementing advanced screening processes, so that way we can systematically identify
Mm,
students who might not be responding to what we apply for an
okay.
entire class. So we can intervene and prevent future occurrences, which is key to
Okay.
providing the earliest onset of behavioral support. I mean, there's a range of specific student level interventions we do, but our approach is to prevent from the beginning, but also establish systems in place and data and practices that effectively support the decision making process, but also provide a medium for, like, okay, instead of opting for kind of what we know, what we've grown up with, your suspensions, your expulsions, your in school suspensions,
Okay.
and even
Yeah.
milder exclusionary practices like sending a student out in the hall, right? Calling administration to come get the student. What are some other things we can do? Not necessarily in response to more challenging behavior, but what are some things we can do to prevent that from occurring? And that's really
Okay.
where, like, our
Excellent.
science is kind of coming
So I
from. It's
mean,
prevention
we
science.
were always going to get here, but you kind of lobbed it up. Because I think you mentioned the types of students. I think you used the word minoritized students who this affects maybe in a disproportionate
Mm-hmm.
way. I'm assuming. All right, so we just got
Mm-hmm.
let's address the elephant in the room. DEI is the boogeyman right now in the political discourse across the
Mm-hmm.
board. It's kind of touching. It's really touching everything right now. Diversity, equity, inclusion is something. Is something like what you're doing with that those elements in mind and behind some even motivation of your studies and implementation of these things. Is that something as something like DEI gets removed from a school system or a business, something like that, in your case school systems, is that affecting your work? It's affecting you personally, but is it actually affecting your work?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, and no. So, yes, in that we we have submitted for external funding, federal funding, and a lot of that has not even gone under review.
Mm,
It got paused indefinitely with the changeover in administration. Colleagues of mine that in some of these grants I partnered with in writing them originally, had funding rescinded. Um, that was focused on creating, not even necessarily like, you know I mean, it was good stuff. It was grants focused on diversifying the workforce, the teacher
Is that
workforce,
across the board, like
and stuff like that got rescinded.
racially, ethnically,
Um,
gender, special needs?
yeah, yeah. So I think and so for those, those were called teacher quality grants, and I think now that there's a judge that's reversed many of those orders, but a lot of those grants across the board
Hmm.
were in some way or another focused on diversifying some aspect of the teacher workforce. So they were across the nation, and so, um, but you know, for me
So
personally,
what's
and
changed?
my
Like
work,
how
I've been able
how?
to continue. Um, we
Like, yeah, not even, I mean, maybe this, but not even like how have you
So
been
how have
allowed
I been able to
to, like,
continue?
corporately, but like how, I know you're always going to press forward personally, but how? Gotcha.
So a lot of my work right now is not necessarily tied to federal funding. So and I have not received any kind of order to like cease and
Hmm.
desist because again, I'm not tied to the government's dollars on that. Right? A lot of my research is right now temporarily funded through like the university. So um, the university is still expressing now.
Yes.
P.S. I'm expressing my views. I should have said this at the beginning. I don't represent the university at all, but these are just my own personal views. Uh, that the university, to my knowledge, has maintained that like
Hmm.
our research and our teaching will remain the same until something comes down that forces us to adapt. So I've been unaffected.
Hmm.
I've been more insecure in my teaching though because
Yeah.
I teach on topics such as disproportionality and exclusionary
Sure.
discipline.
Sure.
That's what I teach on. That's what we spend like the first several weeks of some of my classes talking about. So we talk about intersectionality, bias, racism. We name it. And one of my classes I teach in is a large lecture hall, and I teach, and I think I know there's the odds of someone being in this room that is disagreeing with everything I'm saying
The
right
odds
now
of them what?
is
Disagreeing
high.
or
So I worry
disagreeing?
about that, right? Disagree, or I think there's yeah, just disagreeing in general,
Interesting.
or being anti DEI, for example. I think it's high, but my
Mm.
teaching is committed to just relaying the facts, right? Like I think there's evidence and research to suggest that racism is alive and well, that bias is implicit, that disproportionality in the administration of exclusionary discipline is very present. There's so I lean into that, right? So even
Yeah.
speaking
Okay.
objectively, I can speak to a problem. So that's just what I have to do. I don't, and so my teaching has shifted in that I don't try. I'm very very cognizant in that like I don't. What am I trying to say? I don't really
Hmm. Hmm.
try to change their viewpoints, right? When it's topics as sensitive as that. If it's a specific like competency that they need to know how to do, then that's different. There's limited subjectivity with like how to implement a specific behavioral support, for example. But there's obvious room and space and
Uh-huh.
discourse for people who might walk into a room and say, "Oh, I don't see color," right? Or those types of conversations. And um, so it's this is a little novel terrain for me. I've
Hmm.
always kind of felt a little more safe, even in South Carolina, talking about this stuff. But I've definitely kind of embraced that aspect of my teaching a lot more here, not because of
Yeah.
the
That's really
state that I'm
interesting.
in, but the state of the
Um,
social political climate.
are the demographics, have you noticed, of your classrooms, have they become more diverse over the last like 4 to 5 years?
What's that's hard to say because in education, there is
Right.
the national teacher workforce is primarily um, white and female. That is the teacher workforce across the
That makes
nation.
sense. Yeah.
So, like most of the classes I teach are going to mirror that. And that's not necessarily changed with administrations or anything like that. But that's just kind of been
Sure.
something
Yeah, that makes
I've
sense.
always observed.
I mean, the
But that's in
classrooms
line
I'm
with
in
the
right
national teacher
now
workforce.
are, I mean, I don't know how much you keep up with your alma mater in Radford, but what I've noticed in the English classroom, compared to back in our day, man, like my classrooms are super diverse. I think there's more people of color in the room now than white people, like to be honest. Which little old Radford, like that's crazy to think about from when
Yeah.
we were in undergrad, in there. Like you said, I'm also teaching right now. I'm teaching an English course
Hmm.
that people across the board have to take right now, and so I'm going to get a lot more diversity in those classrooms. Most of them aren't English majors; they just have to take the writing courses. But I've always thought that was interesting. You mentioned the feeling of or the likelihood of somebody disagreeing with the whole whatever DEI thing, and I find myself not even just this year with whatever administration, but about it's a delicate line to balance because like you, I think the goal can't be to change people's mind for your sake to agree with us, but where's the line of objectivity of like this is no, this is an issue, and yes, I might be biased on something like DEI, but how do I also leave room to have discourse with people that agree or disagree?
Right. It's a delicate process of
Yeah,
like creating
yeah,
space, but also shaping and shifting that viewpoint to be more
hmm,
inclusive of like the population you're really focused on serving. Right. So that's a delicate process. Um, it's you know the way I see it, federal laws, regulations, dear colleague letters, they're all going to come in and out the door, and some of them will get thrown out
yeah,
the window. At the end of the day, the thing we can't throw out the window is the student, right? And so that's what I always focus on in terms of like folks serving school age populations and teachers. Federal regulations, all that stuff's going to come in and out the door. Some will go out the window the very next day, as we've seen with this current administration.
mm,
But the
yeah,
student with a disability is going to be in your classroom, right? No matter what. Black, brown, different minoritized youth, different experiences, different traumas, different learning histories. They're all going to be in your room no matter what policy comes in, right? So our commitment is to serving the students that are more of the eternal stakeholders, that they
yeah.
are there and positioned in your room, in your time, in your year with them. So that's what we commit to serving. And so but again, that's you say that, but I understand the layers of it. That's a very black and white way to see it because what comes down at the federal level is always going to trickle down, especially in how they're working to eliminate the Department of Education. What that would mean would be states have access or states have more decision making authorities. So that puts certain states at a high risk of more exclusionary practices, not necessarily discipline related, but like just exclusionary practices in general for different populations. So like mine really like focused on like individuals with disabilities, right? And so there's potential for harm to happen to them. So when we talk about DEI, we're also talking about individuals with disabilities, right?
Can you break
And
down?
so that's
Yeah,
where
can you break
I
down why
and so
eliminating
it's
DEI, but
huh?
specifically eliminating the Department of Education, why that would, in your opinion, it sounds like would be a really negative thing. And just let's have a nuanced conversation. There's perhaps people that would think that's a good thing, whether that's ill-intended or not. Let's just assume it's not for anybody, but let's say some people have the view of, well, that could be a good thing for
Mhm.
something like DEI, or it's good that states have that power then instead. Like, what would you say to something like that? Is there any merit to that in your opinion?
Mhm. I can only speak to like what I know, so I just want to be transparent with like I don't understand and I don't want to pretend that I understand all the nuances of that decision.
Yeah.
But specific to protections for like students with disabilities under IDEA, um, that would be significantly compromised, right? There's congressional powers and protections that come with IDEA, and any kind of reconfiguration of funding mechanisms that are appropriated for that once belonged to Department of Ed. With the abolishment of Department of Ed, those funds would then go to states to determine how those get allocated. So then what you're looking at is a
Mm,
high potential for more privatized parent choice in schooling, which at the very basis of it, they can pick and choose who they want in their schools and not. So
yeah, yeah.
is pretty invasive to a free and appropriate public education for all. But that's again um, determined by your state politics,
Some
really.
states might, for
And
argument's
that's
sake,
where the
do
nuance
it.
comes
It
in
might help.
because maybe, and it's hard for me to like answer that with a yes or no, right? Because I do think there's a ton of layers to it, and I'm trying to be careful not to like
Uh-huh.
unfairly label a red and blue state and how they're going to use funds, right? But I do think there's higher risk for the choices with what to do with those funds that were
Sure.
once governed and appropriated by the federal government. There's higher risk for red states to allocate money consistent with um,
I don't think
the
that's
base.
unfair. I mean,
So,
I think both
and then
sides
vice
that's
versa,
pretty apparent.
right?
And I think that's fair. I think my question,
Yeah,
not even, I'm not
yeah,
arguing because I would
yeah.
totally agree with everything you just said, would be what about people that see it as, well, then I don't know, to paint with broad strokes, the blue states would then have freedom to overcorrect and do better. You might not have the answer to that. I was just wondering to think it all the way through
Mm,
because there's so much for us to weed through, not just us, but like everybody of like, well, what do
yeah,
we believe? Which is what I think a lot of politicians want us to
right.
do is just get tired and check out and let things happen. Um, I mean, with DEI, so none of us are experts on
Hmm.
that either. To me, as a normal just citizen, so like let's try and talk about it a little bit more in like layman's terms, just as people. The jarring thing to me is
Hmm.
that to me that is I can think as long as I can remember being a little kid, something like DEI kind of represents the most like basic level of like across bipartisan issue, like
Hmm.
across political lines, like we can all agree diversity is a good thing. Like like at the equal, I don't know what I'm trying to say, at the on an equal playing field, like we should care about that, even if deep down, like at home, we don't. But like, hey, this is like a thing everyone can agree upon. Like diversity is a good thing. So to me, the jarring thing now is like, whoa, like that's what people like. That's the main one of the main thing, if not the main thing, that an entire administration is trying to do away with. Like that's really, really jarring to me at the human level. Of there's so many layers to racism and discrimination, but like
Hmm.
the most bottom, like low level, low hanging fruit is like what we're focused on getting rid of. To me, I think you agree that that's like the most jarring thing. But I'd wonder if we could also think. I think it's helpful to do a thought exercise sometimes
Right.
on here with this stuff. So the pushback to DEI overall, even with like I've had a conversation with a handful of people that are
Hmm.
not pro conservative or right wing red state type people. They might lean that way, but aren't like gung ho about how things are going, but do have a belief in, well, DEI is kind of turned into reverse discrimination. So it's not a good thing. So like, yeah, it might not be great, but it should be tweaked or gotten rid of because it's reverse discrimination.
Hmm.
I'm willing to have almost any conversation. Like I think that that
Hmm.
is valid in the sense of sure, I think maybe it has been exercised like that some of the time. And if this person's experience is that that is what it is, that's
Hmm.
valid because I and you know that that is not what it is supposed to be in essence. Just hey, reverse discrimination, that's all it is. It's like in the
Hmm.
definition, inclusivity, like it's to include, not exclude. So I feel like there are people perhaps sometimes on both sides, but are missing the essence of what inclusion even is and equity is, and how we need those two things to get to diversity. Um, I'd wonder what you say to that type of belief, in, well, DEI is just reverse discrimination. How do we fix it if we're not going to get rid of it?
Right. So it's like this could be its own, like, not just podcast like episode. It could be its own like series, right? um, but so I'll try to like just
Yeah, I mean,
my
have
own
you ever
personal
been? Are you a
perspectives and experiences,
diversity hire?
ensure that. I mean, like, here's the thing. I've engaged since
Hmm.
DEI seemed to be the branding for this administration, right? I've had several conversations with people that cite, in different words, reverse racism, right? And that, like, I've heard things such
Merit,
as,
yeah.
I got there on my merit, but that means they should too, they being diverse individuals. Assuming that they're not getting their own merit is, there's a layer there, right? But the issue that I run into, so I think people, like, at the very core of it, inclusion is belonging, right? I want to enter a space and I want to feel like I belong. I don't want to feel like I'm the diversity hire, right? I don't want to feel that
Hmm.
I'm not there on my merit. I'm there because of the color of my skin. I want to feel that when I walk into an environment, I belong there. But belonging doesn't happen passively, right? So to promote in this day and age, it doesn't happen passively. We honestly have to systematize. We're programmed for it, and as humans, as organisms, we have history to refer back to, and we see when it's
Right,
not
right, right.
prioritized. When there's a system that works opposite of it, we see what happens, right? We saw that with Hitler and with Nazis. We've seen that across time. Yet we can't take those lessons and learn them and apply them to today. That inclusion means belonging, right? And we have to program for it. We don't let it passively happen. So DEI initiatives, I think, were meant to program for that. To create space and opportunity to increase the probability that belonging happened. So in that process, in that journey, right, it got lost somewhere that, like, that goal was not good for me, right? Or that the people think like that goal sets me back, so I'm not okay with it,
Right, right, right.
right? And me talking as if I'm an anti-DEIer, right? Which I'm not. Like, if I was, it's like, okay, that goal of inclusion and belonging and programming for it, right? It's not good for me.
Hmm.
I feel like I'm back. I feel like I have to fight 10 more battles to get to this point. And then it's such an interesting point that, like, I wish, saying this to a person who we disagree with fundamentally, it never gets me anywhere. But in different words, I'm like, well, now you're talking about equity. So, you're talking that you feel like you don't have equitable access to the same outcomes, same goals, same things, opportunities as a person a diverse individual. So, you know, that connection then is like, yeah, I don't. But the whole
Right.
reason this cult came to be was because there was inequity in the opposite direction, right? And oftentimes, and this is with a broad stroke, you know, I've heard extreme stories about where people are told that like, people say, like, I was told I don't matter because I'm white. No, that probably
Sure.
didn't happen. And maybe it did. And if that did happen, that's not right either, right? But that's not, I feel like that's the stories that are painted by the administration. And then that's what you catch. That's what sticks. And so it's, I've never been in a
Yeah, I mean,
situation
that's
where
a
that
good
was even
point.
said,
I mean,
or where I even heard that said. Like,
even if that is said,
yeah,
I actually think it has been said. What I say to that is, like, I've had a handful of people say, give me honest examples of, and they're not like complete anti-DEIers, but they are people who aren't happy with it, and it comes from personal experience that I've heard from a handful of people say, like, I literally, white people, didn't get a job, was told I didn't get a job because I was white, meaning like they gave it, me and this other person were tied, like had the same level of merit. And I was told I didn't get it because too many white people, like we need to get to a person of color. To that, so like I think that is interesting because to me, I think that that's probably one I would question, like, is that's a strange thing to be told bluntly like that from whoever the employer was. But to me, that doesn't that doesn't mean DEI is being overall done poorly. To me, that's just an example of, and one, I'm not trying to like hide said employer. I don't even know who it was, but like my point is, like, I'm not saying that employers should just never say that. But one, I'm like, that's a weird thing to tell somebody as a potential employer. But also, that's not like that in essence is not how it's supposed to be done. Like you said, we lose people who oppose this, and I keep, like you, talking to people wanting to hear a different answer, but it always indirectly or directly comes back to this willful ignorance to why DEI exists in general, which is exactly what you said. Like, we're allergic to this uncomfortableness, to this just big change and shift, and there's just like a complete willful like ignorance when all you care about is uh a meritocracy. Like, everything just needs to be like, that's what equity is. Like, everything just needs to be by merit, by merit, by merit.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I think we would all actually agree on that if that was possible, and if that's not how things were that we're trying to correct. But then where we get into just an endless cycle, which you touched on, is we're not, because then you have the same people saying, well, let's not talk about the past. And it's just like, well, that is literally, that is impossible. And we're having two different conversations because we're skipping all these steps. We want to jump uh to living in this fictional world where this is where we can live in a meritocracy, and skipping all of these restorative practices or intentional practices. We get really allergic to intentional planning, like you said, like systematic, dare I say, planning of how to remedy actual racism. Um, and it is
Mm-hmm.
hard. Like, if someone doesn't believe that racism is still real, then it's that you just got to kind of cut your losses and move on to hopefully someone else that you can talk to.
And what a defeating
For
like
sure.
thing, right? To cut your losses, right? It's like I've kind of at this point where having conversations about this is so difficult. And thankfully in the university setting, this is a pretty,
Hmm.
pro DEI right environment. I can have free conversations within these walls and these spaces with colleagues, and it's safe spaces. But the moment I step outside of these spaces and I talk, maybe on Facebook, right? Social. I don't. I'm not saying that there's like a anything ever good comes from these social media posts or responding to comments stuff like that. On
Mm.
Facebook is where I go because that's where I have the most mixed political friends. Um, and that's where I see the most diverse perspectives in regards to. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to shape my own perspective to see something maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm super like blinded by something. But the deeper I get into these conversations with people, the more I see that like there's just like there's these frayed, broken connections and thought patterns that like don't connect history with now. And and I cannot convince you that racism is alive and well, then I
Hmm.
I don't know. At this point, I do not know what to do. Um, Beyond, because I mean, like if you think about like how there's been assaults on
Right.
DEI,
Right.
but also assaults on like history curriculum, right? In the schools. And then, but the reason history exists, the reason we learned it is so we learn how to do better, right? We learn what not to do. But that's, getting altered and adjusted. And like now we're in sense of a repeat. And I have people that, like, in previous circles that are
Yeah.
really, really supportive of some of the anti DEI measures that are coming down. And it's hard to swallow, it's hard to hold my tone in my tongue in those moments. But I've gotten to this point where it's just like, I don't know if I can convince you. And I do think we're all kind of like some products of our environment. I do think that, like, for a lot of people, if change, honestly, most sometimes happens when you like change your immediate surrounding and your circle and your people. But if you maintain like proximity with people who are like echo chambers, what opportunity is there to think differently? And I think that's fairly nuanced in a broad stroke to say that, but like I didn't begin to like really kind of combat some of my like, you know,
Mhm.
some of what I was like almost like raised to think in the church. I didn't combat that until I like left, like my left home, moved areas, and Emily and I evolved like together, thankfully, but like in kind of shaping like our own perspectives on like culture, like faith, our vocation, how all that intersects and doesn't. And then, so we've arrived at this uncomfortable space today where it's like, I mean,
Mhm.
I have a hard time having a discussion with you about this because I don't know if there's going to be a point at which we come out and you say, I'm, my perspective has changed. But one thing that's helped is just kind of retelling some of the stories that some of the measures that have come down, the personal impact stories, not my own, but like just of other people. And so it's like when
Yeah.
conversation points like that tends to stick, and there's some humanity, right, in us. We're not beasts. We're not returning to. I hope we're not returning, but there's humanity in us. So like when we share personal stories about like, hey, this is what happened as a result.
Yeah.
You support
For sure.
this, but this is how it impacted this person. And then kind of making those connections. So if we're not going to connect to history and we're going to focus on what's happening right now, then let's connect stories of impact that are happening right now on what's coming down from the government and the federal regulations. And that's been what I've done. And it would take a really like, it would take a special person
Uh-huh.
to ignore that and say whatever, and ignore those personal impact stories that have how what's been happening has directly impacted
Yeah. Proximity
my people
always a
that I
bedrock
consider friends, right?
theme
So,
here on the podcast. Um, I mean, we have similar stories like in church with faith and justice and whatnot. And to be honest, like I draw from my experience, I draw from your experience, I draw from people like
mhm.
our experiences because at the same time, we both would agree that, man, I'm just tired. I don't feel like conversation is getting anywhere anymore. I don't feel like I can talk to certain people anymore, or like, I'm not going to convince A, B, and C of anything at this point. I also am reminded of somebody like me and you, two men of color growing up around a lot of white people, a lot of white conservative people. And it, I remember some of the conversations and some of the things that convinced me to interrogate some of these things in my own life. And that does motivate me somewhat because I'm like, I know a
Yeah,
lot of people, especially in a lot of our circles, will
yeah,
say, well, you're never going to convince somebody by being that profound or that demonstrative or that out loud about it and stuff. And I'm like, maybe sometimes that's true, but that's not always true. Like I listen to people that I get angry. I listen to people that have lost their cool about something. Like sometimes there's a time and place for it. I'm not, you and I are both pretty mild mannered, but sometimes it's like, like sometimes it does call for it. And sometimes that is actually convincing. And I try to push back on the human side of things as much as I can because I'm like, look, it's one thing to like laugh these conversations off and say, "Oh man, these times are just ha ha ha." Like they're so polarized. Like let's all just get along, or we're never all going to get
Mhm.
along because we're just so polarized. And I see some truth to that. But to me, I'm like, there's a difference between laughing off the polarization and the whatever your cancel cultures, your ha 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 funny, like no one can get along era that we're living in. There's a difference between that and diminishing what passionately fighting for getting rid of something like DEI represents to people like you and I. Because I hear that, I'm like, no, you're not seeing, or maybe you are, but like, not you, Mark, but like to these people, I'm like, you're not seeing. This isn't like a funny like Jeopardy question that we're disagreeing on. It's like you're putting as much passion as I am on justice. You're putting as much passion towards uh moving people that look like me backwards, or people that don't look like you backwards in history. And one of the main things that will get me going is like the ignorance to history and this like gut reaction of, well, you're being dramatic if you're comparing it to, slavery or segregation or women's rights, stuff like that. I'm like, maybe we're not there yet, but are are we not headed towards that? Like, is this not making us more adjacent to those times? Like, getting rid of teaching about that stuff in school. Like, do you know what they were doing during those times? Like, they were doing the same things. They were monitoring how people could talk, what people could read. They're cutting things out of books, out of the Bible. Like they were like that. I don't want to move closer to that. Like, can we agree on that?
What makes it acceptable now, right?
Hmm.
Like before we would learn about it, it's like that's all bad. But now it's happening again in different shape and form, right? And sometimes the exact shape and form.
And
But
they're in
we
power.
but there's a broad base of people who are more accepting of it now. And I think but I think it's even more nuanced than like just power, right? I think it's like, and I don't have the answer to it, right? I don't. It's just it's so perplexing to me
Hmm.
how much damage and harm language can do. If I came up to a person and said, "Hey, man, I really want to make sure that they have," if I point over to another individual, like I want to make sure that they have the same opportunity that the other kids do. Do you mind if I make this a little more accessible for them? The person goes, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." But if I came in and said, "Hey, man,
Mm.
there's a DEI violation over there. I'd like to make that accessible for them."
Yeah, that's a good point.
No, 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 no. Right? I think it's like there's a lot of harm that can be done in language. And language is protected. Language has been the thing that's been transcended throughout time and throughout history. Language is what, you know, I think is the downfall of a lot
Hmm.
of reparable relationships here in this time and day right now. So if I walk in and say like, "What's your issue with DEI?" I'm probably not going to get anywhere. If I walk in and say like, "Hey man, like I'm wondering," again, I'm gonna individual disability. So like if I'm in a classroom working with a teacher who might be seeing something a different political background than me, I might say, "Hey, like how can we have help this student feel like they belong in this environment? What can we do to change the environment to make sure that this student has access to the same things that they do?"
Yeah,
They
no,
would
I get what you're saying.
probably
I
not
think that's
validate
tied
as
to
much,
power, but
right?
I 100%
And I
see
think
that.
there's
I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
but it's like we have to tiptoe. So what I hate, David, and I
yeah.
apologize for being like this candid, is that like,
And
why are we the ones
that's
who have to show
gaslighting
grace and
city,
space for
like
this,
in especially the Christian world
right? Like
of,
I don't,
well, you just need like the Christian belief is, just show more grace, more grace, more grace. It's like, well yeah, but it doesn't. We're not told to give license to wrong, right? Like grace isn't just giving is rolling over
no,
and saying, "Oh, I'm
no,
never gonna speak
no,
out."
we're not.
That's not what it is.
Yeah, no, I think, and I get frustrated with people who
Hmm.
say that that's the answer, just to give grace. Like I really find that frustrating because I think in the current climate, yeah, it's the responsibility of not like just like non-white people, but like also like white allies to be really explicit and label racism um, for what it is. But honestly, in terms of like the language, right? Labeling doesn't get me anywhere. I don't know if it's worked for you, but like I've entered conversations where it's like, hey, by the way, like what you're voting for and what you were thinking and saying to me right now, like conservatism is flirting dangerously
I can't even take it
close
farther than
with
that, but yeah, I get what you're
racism.
saying.
Um, and
I'd say
here's what
way more than flirting with, but yep.
the say it again.
Hmm.
Yeah, but like if I glorify the language
Yeah,
anymore, right?
right.
If I say we free willied over the boundary and they're there, I've lost them, right? But it's like, hey,
The whole
it's
question,
it's
that
dangerously
whole
close with
quote, I don't know
racism
who it's
right now,
by,
and I
but
want you to
of
see
it's
why.
nowadays it's more
Um,
offensive to call someone racist than actually being racist. Like that'll get you a lot more pushback than yeah, actually
mm,
being racist. Is well, you can't call me that.
hmm Well, I think it shuts down their doors, right? I just hate that. Like, I really get frustrated that like I feel like I have to tread so
Yeah,
lightly
and
so you
where it
don't
just
shut your
drives me
door in my
insane
face if I
is,
have
and
the
I don't know what to do about
conversation.
this, and I'm not saying I've always navigated this perfectly, is I feel like the opposite, and this is where the whole angry minority thing comes out, is then that the opposite is said about somebody like you and I of David's always got to bring up race. So it's got to bring up the racial element or the justice issue, and can't we just have a normal conversation? And I get that. I'm not saying I've never done that, but my point is, so often it's like, why you have to make everything about race? It's like, was like, well, because that's what is being done. Everything is being made about race, and somebody like me, like I've just committed this for my life. Like I'm not gonna sit back and let that slide. And it's just it's an ignorance to most of the time, to be honest. Of like, I didn't bring it up, you brought it up. I'm just not cool with the way you brought it up. So hey, let's talk about that. But history shows, and I'm sure you dealt with that too, Mark, of like, oh, but you're the one that's labeled as the angry race guy that brought all this up. It's like, no, I I'm just not flying with how you guys are bringing it up.
Yeah,
I didn't bring DEI up. You brought DEI up
yeah.
because you're
No,
getting
I think
rid
it's
of
a
it,
good
and
point. I think it's a good way to
I'm
say
not
it.
cool
It's
with
just
that. I'm the angry one for focusing on DEI too much
right. Like it's like, why are you bringing it up
because
so
it
much?
affects
Why
my
are
whole
you
life.
talking about? Like, listen, because there's been advancements or assaults on it, right? Right. So it's like, I mean, don't get mad at me for bringing up something over and over again because my kids are also Indian, right? Like we're not they're not white, they're half white, but I mean like, you know, I have non-white children, right? I think about what world they will be in. Um, and I worry about that if things continue on the same path. But I think like, you know, I remember David, when people like
Mm.
they try and like massage my concerns though, and that I find frustrating. And I don't know how to respond to it effectively yet. I'll be very transparent. So, for example, I made a post on social media about, kind of where the gravity of the election results hit me was when I realized that, like, hey, like 4 years ago this time, I was showing my daughter that, hey, I had a half Indian woman who's just elected vice president, right? And hoping that then I was going to have an opportunity to show her that, hey, that same person is now president, where she can now articulate and connect those thoughts to feelings. So, and to pride, right? But realizing that I couldn't say that was where the gravity hit me of the election results. Because at first I kind of went numb and like disbelief. I was like, oh my gosh, what just happened? But then people like massaged my concerns about that or my disbelief. And I was like, we have Indian people, the vice president's wife is Indian. We have Indian
Vivek
FBI director. We
Ramaswamy.
have like so like you shouldn't. You have no concern. You have no ground. Right. And so I'm like, first off, don't say that wrong.
Come on, he's Indian.
I'm supposed to be proud of that. But
Yeah.
they massage
Yeah.
the concern or just wipe it away. It's like no, there's Indian people all over the place. You're just focusing on that because it meets your agenda. right? And
Mhm.
it's so
Yeah.
frustrating. I don't have the heart to interact with those people yet. I don't. Because I have to convince you on a lot of other things. We have to peel back a lot of layers. Why should I settle for telling, hey, guess what? Look, the vice president's wife is Indian. Not saying that that's I'm knocking on the title, but like, why should I? Why should that be? If that person's goal was to be in that way, then fine, that's great. Celebrate them. But our goal was to have a person as president. Like
No,
I don't know. It's just
I don't
I'm
think
not
your
trying to
goal
sound like
is I think your
I'm like
goal
reducing
is
to
that we would live in a world where that is celebrated, but it's also not crazy that that would happen. Like, your goal isn't ultimately, like, give me, you know, an Indian person at all costs. Like, I mean, like you just said about Vivek Ramaswamy. Um, I think you're just yeah, the goal is equality and equity and a world where it's not an insane thing to see happen. Yeah.
I
Oh gosh,
have a hard I have a
please,
hard time on Facebook.
please
I've
don't do
stopped
that to yourself,
commenting
man.
on Facebook, and I just it's hard. And I'm gonna get back into it. It's just I recently had an experience where like I commented on a former colleague's like post and about hey just and I thought I was exercising as much grace as I could,
So volatile.
but then the responses are
Yeah.
just so belittling, like dehumanizing. I had a comment, but here's the thing: that when I respond to those
Mhm.
people, kind of like dehumanizing me, my comment was deleted, but theirs remained. Um, and
Mhm.
then the next comment literally referred to me as people like you people. I'm like, oh my god, like this is and yeah, it's just it's heartbreaking, right? Because I can't tell you that that's racist,
I mean,
but
to be fair,
it
do you ever
was and
struggle
it
with
is, and
thinking
I'm
people
gonna
like you
keep
to the other
fighting.
side of things? Because I mean, I check myself sometimes too with that. Yeah, I'm not trying to diminish what you're saying.
100%, 100%. And I've learned that
Yeah,
I think in my conversations, like, it's like I have to
I'd
be careful
agree.
to label, right? So because I think it's really it's like what I try to do, David, is if I didn't know what a person's political leaning was, and I think back to our history and our interactions and our relationship,
Sure.
I'm often
I
reminded
think
that there is
conversation just has to
humanity
happen.
beyond the way they voted. But
Yeah,
that yeah, that doesn't stop there. It doesn't mean I don't have conversations with them. It's that like I have to then hold true to that, like, okay, I'm about to come into an uncomfortable space with you. I'm going to maintain
right.
your humanity throughout this whole thing because of our relationship and our history with each other. And I'm going to really try to. You
And
check me if you feel
it's
like
not
I'm not,
two-sided.
but I get that same right,
Often,
right?
not to try and on purpose, like you said,
Exactly. It's
label
like,
everybody, but I'd agree with that. We've talked about this. I, yeah, I mean, I try not to comment on stuff too. I will every once in a while if I
mhm,
see something that is egregious enough and is in mutual community in some way with me and people I know. I'll say something, especially if someone's gonna put it out there, and I'll make sure to keep it in the comments. Like, I'm not some if I'm gonna comment, it's gonna be in the comments, and I'm not gonna like if someone tries to, oh hey, message me separately. No, 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 no. You put this out here,
right.
so we can have this discourse out. You're not just gonna put this out here and not be able to answer. Like, if you comment, I'm a big believer in that. If you comment, if you put something out there, you have like it's fair to
It's
answer
hard.
anything that you were asked about it. I'm not saying you deserve to get
Hmm.
verbally assaulted or something, but you have or harassed. Like, you have to be able to back up what you're talking about. And it goes both ways. I try and do that too. And if I can't, I don't post. But if I make a mistake, I'm like, dang, I'm gonna take that on the chin. And I posted something to go back to just humanity about just empathy a few months ago about just for sure the backdrop was in response to the political climate and the current administration and just empathy, like pleading with people to understand why people like black and brown people and other minoritized people are feeling a certain way. And I had somebody come at me in my DMs about empathy. It was just like and I kept it real. I had a very kind response to this person, and they're just like, well, no one had empathy for us like when Biden was in office. And like I was like, there's so much behind this, but I was like, okay, well, like one, I'm not even saying this as I wasn't saying this as a Biden person. Like I was just like, we we
Mhm.
need a lot of you guys need help with empathy right now was kind of the backdrop of it. And he was like, well, no one had empathy for us. So I just asked questions. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like, can you tell me more about that? And it's like, well, there's just so many examples. Like, I can't even begin to start. And I'm like, okay, well, just one. I was like, just give me one. Like, what did you not get empathy for? He's like, oh man, I could just go back through like history of decades of just all these things that have been done by every president. I'm like, okay. I just kept saying, give me one. Like, I love to understand what you're talking about. And I was just waiting for, I was waiting for an opportunity to share any of mine. Never got there, but I was like, okay, just give me one. He must have had like 3 or 4 other responses that were along the same lines. I was like, yeah, but could you just give me, I just really want to hear one thing. And it was just kind of ghosting.
Or they say,
Yeah. I'm like, just one, just give
they
me,
say, "Have you seen the
please
news?" And
just
I'm
give
like,
me
"I'm like,
one.
but
And
give
then the
me
conversation just kind of
yours,
ended. He's like,
right?"
oh, well, I don't think we'll ever agree. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Like again, I'm not the one that brought this.
Mhm.
Like I'm here. Like I'm an open book when I'm posting something about that. You came to me. Let's talk. Yeah.
But those are like, we are a family of science.
Hmm.
We follow science. We in my field we follow evidence, right? We inform what we do through data. We like so like it is so such a I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. For me, it is so
Right. Right.
infuriating
Right.
to hear people not be able to cite
Yeah.
one specific example that supports what they're saying, right? But it's,
Oh,
hey, we've all seen Wicked, right? Both Republicans and Democrats.
that.
You create the enemy and you got yourself a following. Um, and so I think that's so rich and so true and relevant to what we see right now. The enemy is being created, but unfortunately, like it is the enemy are like they're real people, you know. And I will continue to support and advocate for LGBTQ rights, follow science, refer to data, follow research, conduct research, and support people who are black, who are brown, who are individuals with and without disabilities, but I recognize that the environment is not supportive of certain populations of people, certain samples within the larger population. So, if the environment is not supportive, then the environment needs to change and be altered and corrected to be supportive of all. And unfortunately, people who are anti DEI are thinking that they're the people who've been sent backwards and now they're the ones who have to come forward. Um, to meet everyone else. And that is just so unequivocally like not true. And it's so frustrating and hard to have conversations with people about that. But broad strokes, right? I will work on my labeling. I want to understand their perspectives. But at some point, like as much grace as I give people with this stuff that just right now infuriates me, I'm
Hmm.
gonna need some
Yep.
I'm gonna need some reciprocal space to share and challenge what they're saying because I can only take
Yeah.
so much and hold so much space for
And
people for
I
this
think there's some
for
merit to that. Like
racism,
there's
right?
some
Um,
validity to
and
psychological safety. Like I've heard that term recently with some people, even processing with people who are like considering
Mhm.
leaving places like a church or something. And there's so many layers that people like you and I have to deal with. And maybe I sound like I'm just playing the violin here. That's fine. I tell people all the time, there's a difference between like open racist people bother me, but not as much as people who I can't tell. And what I mean is like people that if they wear it on their sleeve, that's so easy to be like,
Mhm.
you're not with it. Like uh, uh, we're not going to get anywhere. Like you're not that someone can't change, but you know what I mean. Like that's fine. You're open. Like I appreciate it now. I know where you stand. So people that are just you're walking on eggshells, you're tiptoeing around. They're like, "Ah, dang, I don't know, or like are lukewarm, or like in the middle, and like uphold, like almost idolize neutrality and being in the middle. That like are psychologically, like I think, can be traumatizing. in those environments. But I'd wonder, as I mean, we got to wrap up, but like I stole this from another
Hmm.
podcast. They're talking about, it was on a podcast called Higher Learning. It's a thought exercise because as much as we're talking about there can be individual cases, individual conversations, there's a lot of nuance. It's really hard to convince me that the pushback on DEI isn't motivated by, to paint with super broad strokes, racism, because I don't know how a rise in DEI or inclusivity and diversity that doesn't that doesn't the pushback doesn't come from an awareness of, whoa, things are changing. There's a little bit too many black and brown people around me now, or people with disability or women. It's become a little too diverse. But you guys in power, like, have the
Hmm.
power to make sure this doesn't keep happening. Boom, let's go with that. And I think racism has always been what people come back to do some horrible things historically, but it's always the backdrop for so many unjust things. And I think a good thought exercise is this. This is from their podcast. I got there finally. Is if you, which I don't ever watch, but like in the NFL, especially during our Super Bowl time, the last couple of years they've had, at least last year, they had the words "end racism," which is hilarious to me, in the end zones. And then this year, for whatever reason, I don't know if it was directly because of the administration or not, but they took it out and had something else in there. So no more end racism. I think a large part of taking something like that out is because people don't want to, they want to watch the football game. They don't want that political issue to interfere with their game watching experience.
Over.
But what I'd say to that, and this is the thought exercise, is what if it says something else? Like, what if it said end child abuse or child trafficking? You think, I would bet all the money in the world that there wouldn't be
Hmm.
that kind of pushback. And I think that's a great heart check and a great thought exercise to think, okay,
Hmm.
why? Like, why would no one? I think no one. I could be wrong. I think no one. Again, to paint with
Hmm.
brush strokes, but I have a problem with that. No one's gonna be like, oh, come on, get. I don't want to hear about that. Like, get that out of the way. It's interfering with my watching of football. No, because that's objectively something that we can all get on board with that exists, and we should be talking about. And racism, though, like that,
Hmm.
there's reasons why that hits people differently than
Right.
other justice issues. You can insert a bunch of other things in there, but I, I think I'd want people who are listening to think about, yes, the laws and the nuance, but the human side of where you're at with where you stand with the DEI and rollback of the DEI conversation.
I think it's, and I think it's a really good example what you brought up. But as much as we can, we have to hold on to, and I need to do better about this. I started this way and I felt defeated, but I need to jump back into space and have these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'll honestly rein back, because it's hard to rein right back in to conversations that are so polarizing, but like, you know, that just, we're talking about like humans, people, but hold on to humanity as much as we can. Because like, I try and think back to the people that, like, hey, we've had good conversations, we've had a lot of fun together, we've had relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and now I learn your perspective on these things and I see you totally different, right? And it alters and adjusts my perception of a person. So I am trying, and I think this is a lot easier said than done for most. And I don't want anybody to take this as I'm saying belittle your own experiences, belittle and sidecast racism, but let that humanity be kind of like the lens at which you communicate, right? If I'm talking to you about racism, let me focus on the humanity, the humans in our lives that are greatly impacted by this, because you are a human in my life. Personal stories, conversations at bars, coffee shops. Social media might not necessarily be the platform that I jump right into right away, but those things are going to be happening for me, I hope, organically, because I have to commit to putting myself in spaces
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
open the probability of these conversations happening, right? And because, again, acknowledging, right? This is a quote that's been applied to different contexts, but every
Mm.
system was perfectly designed to get the result that it does, right? So if I continually refuse to engage with people who don't think like me, I will be enabling and facilitating a system in which, you
Right.
know, I'm in an echo chamber myself. And so if there's like any kind of spur for change or whatnot, I can implement some individual level systems while
Mm,
acknowledging the larger system is perfectly designed to get the result that it does. And that's right now, it is a big push
yeah.
on, you know, the anti DEI, right? And so I just, it's a growing process for me. I think this is, you know, historically we've seen this in our nation, in the
Mm,
world, but it's still such novel terrain for me to know how to navigate this the right way. Um, so, and I think it is for a lot of people, but I appreciate you and your work you're doing and just having conversations.
mm,
It's getting increasingly more difficult for me to have those conversations, and I hope that I'm able to jump back into the arena to have those, and I plan to. It's just it's transparently, right? Since we're on the podcast,
yeah.
it has been increasingly difficult. And I've never really been one to shy down from conversation, but there's a part of me that feels defeated. I think the way to get me out of this space is to hold on like to humanity, and we must have these conversations and create these spaces. But it has to be reciprocal, man. Like I just feel like I, you I just feel like
Absolutely. Man,
we're
I want you to prioritize your health, man. Like
overworking
you don't
to create spaces.
your voice is valuable, so I want it out there personally, but man, you don't owe it to anyone. Like I want you to prioritize man, your mental, emotional health. Like it can be healthy to check out and yeah.
Well, I think it goes for everyone too. Treat yourself with what you need. So I think cathartic practices. All the resources we might spend on certain things. Maybe
All right,
we reserve
man.
some of those resources to
I gotta
take
let
care
you
of
go, man. I
ourselves.
appreciate you taking some time out of your spring break to jump back here on the pod. Man, I promise I'm not gonna wait 70 episodes to have you back on. Um, yeah, you man,
That
yeah,
sounds
your
good.
perspective on all this
I appreciate
has
you
been
looking at me,
edifying
brother.
and super valuable. But yeah, buddy. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. The music you listen to is done by a guy Dylan Dent. Our artwork was created by Ashley Bush, and we'll see y'all next time. Thanks, man.